Okay, so next study that you are going to look at is Levine's study. Now, Levine's study is looking at cross-cultural altruism and helping behaviours, hence all the flags up here. Now, helping behaviour refers to voluntary actions that are intended to help others, and it is a form of what you would call pro-social behaviour. So the idea is, are strangers more likely to receive help in some cities than others, and if so, why? So several factors have been looked at in the past, and these include things like population size, the rate of population change, economic factors, cultural values, things like that. So I just want you to kind of pause the video here for a second, and I want you to make a note in your notes, some kind of prediction about whether you think each of these four factors will affect whether people are going to help strangers or not. So how do you think being in a city with a large population might help? Being in a wealthy city? Being in a collectivist city compared to an individualistic culture. So please remember that in collectivist cultures, highest priority is given to the welfare of one or more collective entities, so like a tribe or a community. Whereas in individualistic societies and cultures, there is an orientation towards the individual and the nuclear family. So, which one of those might affect whether you get helped or not. And a city where there is a rapid pace of modern day living. So I'll pause the video here and just try and make a bit of a prediction in your notes about how each of those might affect behaviour. So, in terms of the background to this study, there are some already existing theories of helping behaviour. So, the first one that we're going to look at is social exchange theory. So, this is the idea of people might be more likely to help because they want to gain goods from the one that they are helping. So, similar to previous studies that we have looked at when it comes to doing a cost benefit analysis before performing a certain behaviour, you might calculate the rewards and the costs of helping others, aiming to maximise those rewards. So actually, I might be more likely to help somebody if actually they're going to give me something in return. And that's the idea of social exchange theory. The responsibility pro-social value orientation. So this is the understanding that your feeling and belief in your responsibility to help is going to be the strongest influence upon the likelihood of helping behaviour. So if you really think you can help that other person, you're probably more likely to do so. Reciprocal altruism. So this is the idea that the incentive for an individual to help is based on the expectation of potential receipt in the future. So reciprocal basically means that it's kind of reflected back. So like reciprocal giving, if I give you a present on your birthday, you're going to give me one. And that's a reciprocal agreement that we have in place, and sometimes it's just generally unspoken. So the idea is that you do something nice for somebody in the hope that they will return, or the expectation that they will return that favor in the future. There's kin selection theory. So this means that you may actually be more likely to help people who have a similar genetic base as yourself, because it aids the survival of that genetic group. So you might be more likely to help people of like the same race, same ethnicity, people from the same place, things like that. And finally, Milgram actually suggested that people who are in urban areas are less helpful than those who are in rural areas. Okay, so actually, strangers in kind of urban areas are more likely to go unnoticed because there's an overload of kind of environmental stimuli to cope with, whereas urban dwellers are kind of focusing their attention on kind of personally relevant things like their land and their job and their tasks. And in relation to that, there have been other studies that have been conducted in a variety of different cultures, so USA, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, and they've actually found that yes, people who are in urban areas tend to be less helpful than those in rural areas. So I would just make sure you've got each of these in your notes. Now, a lot of these pieces of research into those theories and the helping behaviour have generally focused on a single variable, and that variable, more commonly than not, is population size. So we're mostly testing the idea that the bigger a place, the less likely you are to help. Um, Now, there's a couple of pieces of research to go with that. So Stabley found that there was general support for this idea. So actually, when you get to a population of roughly 300,000, there seems to be a decline in the helping rate. And did a bit more further research looking at those kind of urban and rural environments, and actually found that there was two ends to this scale. So that 300,000 population size did apply to urban environments, as they were one of the least helpful groups, but actually there was also a rural environments group of environments that have 5,000 people or less, and they're not particularly helpful either. So there's kind of, like I said, two ends of the scale to that. And there's also other cultural differences. So another difference is the collectivism individualism difference. Now, I just mentioned this before, but collectivists tend to attend more to the needs and the goals of the group, and individualists focus on themselves. So collectivists may be more likely to help those in-group members, so that could apply to that kin selection theory, whereas you might be less likely to help somebody who doesn't belong to your group, so like a stranger. So many studies have looked at helping rates and how they differ between communities in a single culture or country. So, we've looked at urban and rural environments in kind of one culture. Very few studies have actually tried to do a large-scale cross-cultural piece of research. So that's really what Levine's study is trying to do. So this study has three main goals. So the first goal is to determine if a city's tendency to offer non-emergency help to strangers is stable across situations over a wide range of cultures. So that means we're testing, is helping strangers a cross-culturally meaningful characteristic of a certain place. So we put into place several different opportunities for somebody to help a person, and each of those opportunities was given within the same culture, and then we're trying to determine, are they helpful across all of those situations within that culture. Another goal was to obtain a descriptive body of data on helping behaviour across cultures using identical procedures. And that was really in order to establish whether helping strangers varies across culture. And finally, to identify country-level variables that might relate to differences in helping. Now, we used three theoretical explanations for that final one, the community level differences. So we looked at these three community level differences that have not been considered in previous cross-cultural research. So we looked at the idea of economic explanations, cultural values, and cognitive explanations. So economic, it could be that the greater the economic prosperity or the wealth of a city, the less likely the city's inhabitants are to help strangers. Cultural, again, looking at that collectivist individualistic, and also another cultural factor that I'll mention shortly. And finally, cognitive. So are you actually going to notice when somebody needs your help, or are you kind of overloaded cognitively by the pace of life that you have, how busy your everyday life is? So this is a cross-cultural quasi-experiment, okay? So it's known as a quasi-experiment because your main independent variable here is the people in each city, and that is naturally occurring. It's also an independent measures design because obviously the people were only in one city out of the 23 large cities that were tested. Now, these 23 large cities, now in most cases, these were chosen because they were the largest in each country. Now, the selection of countries was aimed at obtaining the widest possible sample of regions and cultures of the world. However, for practical reasons, the selection was sometimes driven by convenience. Okay, so I'll explain who the researchers were shortly, and then that will kind of explain to you why convenience sometimes affected the countries that were chosen. But out of these 23 large cities, it would just be useful for you to know a few. So, for example, Rome was one, New York, Rio de Janeiro, Shanghai, Budapest, Madrid, Calcutta, Kuala Lumpur. Okay, so that's just a selection of them. So we used these three measures of helping. So I mentioned these before. We provided three different opportunities for someone to help so that we could compare whether a particular city in a particular culture was helpful equally or fairly equally across these three measures. So while they're helpful culture. So we essentially wanted to use 5 helping situations, but we ended up with 3. Now, the 2 that we kind of disregarded, one was asking for change, and one was seeing how many mislaid letters would be picked up and posted on. So if you'd kind of written a letter, written an address on it, put a stamp on it or whatever, and then you kind of left it somewhere, would someone pick it up and post it on? Now, we ran into difficulties with some of these in terms of actually analysing them. So, for example, when we were going around and asking for change in this research, I say we, like I was there, but when the researchers were going around and asking for change in this situation, in Calcutta, for example, in India, there was a general shortage of like small value coins and change and notes. So that would have significantly affected how likely it was in that country that somebody was going to offer change. And similarly, the lost letter technique was even more problematic in the sense of residents of Tel Aviv were afraid to touch letters because they might have contained explosives, and there could have been in some of the less developed countries a lack of post boxes. So like these other kind of extraneous variables would have affected our ability to measure helpfulness on those 2 variables. So the 5 that we wanted to look at were dropped down to 3. And these were what's known as non-emergency situations. So you're not kind of diving in to save anybody's life, but you're just being generally helpful. So the first was whether the victim dropped a pen, whether the victim had a hurt or an injured leg, and whether the victim was blind and trying to cross the street. So these are the 3 cases when you had the opportunity to help somebody. Now, all of these measures of helping behaviour were administered in 2 or more locations in city centre districts, so they were kind of downtown districts. In main business hours, they were on clear days in the summer month of 1 or more years between 1992 and 1997. So I'm just going to run through each of those conditions in a little bit more detail. So in the dropped pen condition, the researchers who were kind of playing these Confederate people carefully practiced all of this beforehand. So they walked at a carefully practiced, moderate pace of 15 paces every 10 seconds. Experimenters would walk towards a solitary pedestrian who was passing them in the opposite direction, and when roughly 10 to 15 feet from that participant, the experimenter would reach in their pocket, and as their hand came out of their pocket, they would accidentally drop a pen, and they showed that they didn't notice that they had dropped the pen as it kind of flung behind them. Now, they made sure this was done in full view of that person who they were considering to be the participant. There is a note up here in relation to the participants. So only individuals who were walking alone were selected, and they excluded people, for example, who were like children, so under 17, those who were disabled or old or carrying heavy packages, so wouldn't have been able to help. And they selected the person who they were going to kind of approach quite randomly by approaching the second potential participant who crossed a predetermined line. So they were kind of in the mindset, a predetermined line somewhere on this street, and the second person who would cross that line, they would approach them as a participant. So a total of 214 men and 210 women were approached in this trial. Now, you were counted as helping in this helping measure if you either called back the experimenter and said, "Excuse me, you've dropped a pen," or if they picked the pen up and brought it to the experimenter, then you were counted as helping. The next one was the hurt leg. So, for example, you might be walking with a heavy limp and wearing a large, clearly visible leg brace, not dissimilar to the one in the picture. There was no crutches. So no crutches, please note that this isn't like an indication of how they actually looked. This isn't an actual experimenter, but it's just to show you what we mean by a leg brace. So they accidentally dropped and then unsuccessfully struggled to reach down for a pile of magazines as they came within 20 feet of a passing pedestrian. So we managed to get a total of 253 men and 240 women that we approached here. And you were counted as helping if you either offered to help or you went to begin helping without offering. And again, all those same rules from the previous helping measure apply. And the last helping measure was helping a blind person. So experimenters were dressed in dark glasses, they carried white canes, and they acted as somebody who was blind and was trying to cross the street. So they had the canes provided and also training provided for the role by Fresno Friendship Centre for the Blind. So their behaviour should have been authentic of somebody who is blind, and so are the materials. So what these experimenters who were playing a blind person attempted to do was locate downtown corners with crosswalks, traffic signals, and also had a moderate steady pedestrian flow. Okay, so by a crosswalk we mean like a crossing area that was signalled by a traffic light, like you do just like of outside college, it's a official crossing and it's manned by traffic lights and there's a green man for you to go. So they would step up to the corner just before the light was about to turn green. They would hold out their cane and wait until somebody offered help. So either if nobody offered help, the trial was terminated after 60 seconds or when the light turned red, whichever occurred first. And then they would walk away from the corner. So a total of 281 blind trials were conducted. And you were classified as helping if you at least informed the experimenter that the light was green and that they could go. So data was gathered, and this is why sometimes it was kind of bound by practicality. in terms of which countries you could visit. It was gathered by interested and responsible students who were either travelling to foreign countries for the summer, or if they were returning to their home country during the summer. Or alternatively, perhaps by a cross-cultural psychologist and their student in other countries. Now, all the experimenters were college age, and they were all dressed neatly but casually, and just in terms of controlling for the effects of gender in some cultures, in some cities, men and women may be treated differently. All the experimenters were made male. The experimenters' behaviour was also standardised in terms of how they behaved and how they scored helping. So all experimenters received a detailed instruction sheet and on-site field training for their acting roles, and for learning how to select a participant and how to score the participant. So the experimenters were able to practice together to ensure that standardisation. And the third thing that was put in place is there was to be no verbal communication between the experimenter and any of the participants. So the dependent variable was the helping rate of the 23 individual cities. So for the purpose of analysis, obviously they tested individual participants, but then that was combined into an overall helping index. So in terms of the findings, the participants really are the 23 countries. So you have 23 overall helping indexes. So the three measures of helping were also correlated with statistics in terms of community values. So they reflected things like population size, economic well-being, cultural values, and pace of life. So I've already mentioned individualism and collectivism, but there is also another cultural factor which will become apparent later on in the study. So I'd make a note of it. And that is this idea of a culture of simpatia, or otherwise known in Portugal as simpático. So this is essentially where you are friendly, nice, agreeable, and good-natured. So you are someone who is fun to be with, pleasant to deal with, and you prioritise all of those characteristics over things like achievement and productivity. So it's like a word in Spanish culture that doesn't really have like a specific English translation, but it essentially means that you have this feeling of community and compassion, and you have a good work ethic and things like that. So there are lots of countries, including kind of Brazil, Portugal, Spain, and a few others, which would be classed as having simpatia or simpatico. Now, the community variables that are used for that third goal of the study are as follows. So you've got population size, purchasing power, parity, cultural values, and pace of life. So population size was measured by getting the number of people living in a city for the year in 1992, so when this study kind of started. Now this was taken from the US Bureau of the Census, or if it wasn't available from there, because we're not looking at somewhere in America, for say, we also got this data from the United Nations. Okay, so it was kind of official statistics that represent how many people are in there. So that's how we know that all of them were populated at a minimum of 230,000. So that tells us how many people are in that city. We also looked at purchasing power parity. Now, this is an indicator of economic well-being or wealth of a country. So this essentially measures how much the average income earned in that country is capable of purchasing. And we've got these statistics from the World Bank. So in other words, if you earn that average wage and you went to do your food shopping, how much could you buy? So how much could you fit in your basket, basically? Cultural values. So this was looking at collectivism and individualism. So you were rated on a scale as a country of 1 to 10, from 1 being most collectivist to 10 being most individualistic. Now, some of these ratings already existed from previous pieces of research. And we also considered that Spanish and Latin American countries were classified as sympatia, and any other country was classified as non-sympatia. So we could compare those two cultural values against one another as well. And the last one was pace of life, and this comes down to kind of how busy a life, how overloaded cognitively may you feel. So we measured this by getting the Confederates to time the speed at which 35 men and 35 women who were average pedestrians who were walking alone covered a distance of 60 feet in the same locations as the helping measures were taken. Okay, so this was kind of pace of life measured in time. Now, overall, really what we found here is we did look at gender differences in helping behaviour, and we found that there was no significant gender differences in terms of who helped in the dropped pen or the hurt leg condition. We didn't check this with the helping the blind person cross the street because we didn't denote how many, were male and how many were female in this particular helping measure. So there's not a distinctly different, significantly different number of men and women who helped. In terms of that first goal, so looking at that first one, we looked at the degree of consistency in helping measures to measure helpfulness. So if a country helped in one condition, were they also more likely to help in another condition? So we kind of correlated the blind person, drop pen, hurt leg conditions against one another. Now we can see that all of these correlations go in a positive direction. So that suggests that overall a city's helping rate is relatively stable across all of the measures. Not all of them were significant in terms of being a correlation, but they are consistent. So the more likely you are to help a blind person, you're also probably more likely to hurt somebody who has helped somebody who's hurt their leg, for example. Again, these kind of pure figures, you don't need to know all these pure figures, so don't feel like you need to copy every single one down. You may just want to make a note, perhaps of one that's significant there. So, for example, the drop pen hurt leg is significant. In terms of those cultural differences, we are just going to again display a table of where all of the countries appear to rank in terms of their helpfulness. Again, please don't feel like you need to sit there and copy down all of these because you don't. It's just worth selecting a couple. Oh, 1 second. Okay, try again. So here we go. Here's the table of all the results. Like I say, don't sit there and copy down this table. You don't need to know them. So you can see here is the extensive list of all the 23 countries, as I only gave you a few at the start. So there's a couple of key things to take away from this, and that is picking out the most helpful and the least helpful of all the countries, okay? What you can say is that Rio de Janeiro in Brazil is the most helpful country. You can see that they're fairly consistent across all three measures, just like we said earlier on, so they weren't more likely to help the blind person than the drop pen person. So again, this just shows us that they're equally as consistent across all three. But what I would say is note down their overall helping percentage for just a few of these countries. So like I say, Rio de Janeiro the most helpful, then San Jose in Costa Rica, Malawi, Calcutta, Vienna, Madrid. So just note down kind of maybe the top 2 or 3. And I would also note down perhaps the bottom 2. So Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia appeared to actually be the least helpful, with an overall helping percentage of 40.33%, followed just after by New York, 44.67%. So like I say, they appear to be fairly consistent across each of the measures, really. Now, what we can also say, whoops, too many clicks. What we can also say is countries which were classified as being sympatia. So overall, we had 5 that were classed as being sympatia. So we have got Rio, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Mexico, there you are, and Spain. So we can see that all of those are in the kind of the top 11, so the top 50% really, of the most helpful countries, so less than 50% really. So they were seen as more helpful on average than non-sympatia countries. So the average helping rate of those 5 countries that were classified as sympatia was 82.87%, and the average of those countries classified as non-sympatia was 65.87%. Now, some people have also suggested here that it may not just be purely sympatia, because those countries that we've classified as sympatia, quite a few of them also have primarily kind of Roman Catholic populations, and they're also societies of kind of cultures of honour, and therefore some people have suggested that it might be worthwhile doing a bit of further research with those sympatia countries in order to kind of detangle these two variables of religion, honour, and sympatia or simpatico, in order to kind of study them separately to figure out which one is contributing there. Okay. And in relation to that third and kind of final goal was looking at the community variables that may be influential in the helping behaviour. We've got here a table of the correlations. So actually you can see that the only ones which were significant are the ones in the red boxes with a star next to them. So these were the only ones that appeared to be significant as correlations, and they all relate to PPP. So the only significant relationships were between PPP, and as these are all negative correlations, it actually suggests that the more wealthy the inhabitants of a city are, the less helpful they are. There was also small but statistically insignificant relationships between the walking speed and the overall helping. So there's a small relationship there, but actually, like I say, that's statistically not significant. More individualistic cultures showed somewhat less overall helping. So countries where you kind of valued yourself as opposed to valuing the group overall, but particularly in the hurt leg situation than those collectivist countries. But again, none of those correlations were significant, and there was no relationship whatsoever between the population size and the helping behaviour. Okay, and all of that was worked out through statistical analysis. Now, 2 community variables of economic productivity and the individual collectivism and walking speed were actually kind of highly correlated with each other. So economic productivity was, so the PPP was positively correlated with individualism and negatively correlated with walking speed. So faster places had stronger economic productivity. So the faster pace kind of the better off you are economically, and individualism was negatively correlated with walking speed. So faster places were more individualistic. So a place which is faster is more individualistic, and that place which is more individualistic is also likely to be more economically productive at the same time. So, really, we've got some general conclusions here. So, they are that the helping of strangers is cross-culturally meaningful as a characteristic of a particular place. There's large cross-cultural variations in helping rates. Helping varies across culture, in other words. Helping across cultures is inversely related to a country's economic productivity, or their PPP. Cultures with a tradition of sympathia are on average more helpful. Although faster cities tend to be less helpful than slower cities, the link between economic health and helping is not a byproduct of a fast-paced life in affluent societies. And the value of collectivism, individualism, is unrelated to helping behaviour.